So there is one small copy is there, and the tone of that copy, see the tone of the copy actually. Wrong email or password. That oops makes a difference actually. So the site I've seen somewhere. So when it's like that iPhone is there for a long time. When we put a wrong password, the box itself shakes and whatever it is that starting things goes to a ocean. So small little things, but it became memorable for me. So I think it will be nice. See the kind of buttons now we are seeing. It's not just submit or kind of stuff. There is a copy there, there is a micro copy there saying that 30 days free trial. Get started in 30 seconds. It's a big difference. Look at the button again. Show me how much money I'll save. Very user-centric, very human-centric style of communication. Must be seeing 404 pages there and now. So it's not the 404 page. So microcopy is really good for this kind of error messaging because we'll be apologizing to somebody. So the tone, if you can set a friendly tone, if you can set a right friendly tone, that person can stay there, stay with us. Otherwise, you just left the scene. One of the nice microcopies I seen from MailChimp. So MailChimp, if you guys are using MailChimp, you can see. So whenever you open MailChimp, you'll get a greeting message. And every time you open the MailChimp, the message will be different. So they made a 500, 600 messages, and according to the user and the time frame and the context. If you are opening the MailChimp in a Diwali day, the message would be like greeting about the Diwali. That's made to connect with that product, right? So again, a forward for error page, note that it happens. The slide screen, the locking screen is best. So see, the user persuasion is kind of created. Like there's a gradient happening from left to right. So you always, it will be helpful.
Next session is starting workshop. Those who want to attend. Yeah, so just 2 minutes.
It's done. Okay, so that's it. If you have any questions, we can discuss about it by your side.
Yeah, we can take one question. Anyone has a question?
I mean, if you could briefly, in one line, say the difference between copy and microcopy, what is that?
So, microcopy is basically first of all, as the name suggests, it will be one sentence, small thing. We always
You mean a sentence or one?
only one single thing. It can be a two-step kind of stuff.
Healthcare segment. So unlike many other software providers, they are focusing only on healthcare, and it's got its advantages and disadvantages. So one good thing is that over the decade of experience that they've had, they've accumulated a whole lot of information about healthcare, and that's what is being shown in the products and solutions that we are actually developing. Why the topic of socio-technical systems? Personally, it's an interesting topic for me because I'm doing a research program on socio-technical design website itself, and it's also got an impact on the professional side of the house. Socio-technical design has a few areas that is still being used in, and the healthcare segment is one area that is still being used in. So So these are few of the areas which prompted me to pick up this as a topic of discussion. This is what we quickly cover today. Apart from a peek into what social technical design is, we'll also touch upon the overlap between HCI, UCD with social technical design. So before I start off, I'll leave you with this with this quote from Berners-Lee. Berners-Lee is a computer scientist who's actually come up with this quote, who actually talks about the social and ethical impact on technology. And you will be seeing this a lot in today's world, where all of the sites that have a social impact are being held up for the content that they provide. Right? You just can't post anything and get away with it, be it from a moral police or from from a legal side of the house also. So what he's actually trying to say is that technologists and technology cannot ignore the fact that social and ethical questions related to people have to be answered. So that's the important take that he has, and we'll see over the course of the presentation how this plays out. So before I get started, just want to understand from the crowd if anybody's actually been involved in creating socio-technical designs, or if you've heard of this topic before. Could you give me a quick show of hands so that I can understand the pulse of the audience? Okay, fine. So understanding that not many people do have this, but so the focus will be more to probably give you a quick understanding of it, and to also see how it's impacted other areas. You saw in the other presentation, if you're in this track, how we touched upon experience design, user-centered design. Now, all of these field of studies have actually filled a lot of gaps that the social technical designs have brought about. Let me talk about that. First, in terms of definitions, let's touch upon what social technical designs are. So these are systems which not only include technical systems, but also the operation process and mainly the people who are involved in this, right from the interaction to the dependencies that they have on other departments and so on and so forth. It is more of a holistic approach to the design of engineering projects. So that's the traditional definition of socio-technical systems. But if you look at the modern day definition, it really does not apply as much, because in the modern day, we look at any social system operating on a technical base. So if you look at your emails, your chat, your bulletin boards, your wiki, all of them are now considered as socio-technical systems. But if you look at the traditional definition, it really doesn't fit it. And I talked about it when I touched upon the history of this topic. Okay? But to set the context, here's a quick example. So take a typical scenario of a website being developed, which starts as a very minimalistic website. You have two people working on it. Wade was a back-end developer who's hardcore in that area. And then you have Rinda, who's a front-end designer who does the magic with the words, with the designs and so on and so forth. Now they interact very closely on a regular basis to ensure that the site is up and running. And every few weeks, every few months, you have this update that goes in where they interact very closely. And in the traditional systems, they had the web developer doing a lot of work initially and passing it out to the designer to do the magic. But now it's changing, where the design player takes on the frontal role, and then you fit in the pieces of the software later. So this is fine in a typical environment. But what happens when the site grows? What happens when an organization grows? There's a lot more complexity involved here. There are critical pieces of the project which are interdependent, which need people like Brinda and Wave to interact with each other. And that's where the complexity builds in. So if you notice that there will be a lot of dependency on each other between system, across people, across code, across design, all of that which comes into the picture. And that, in simple words, is when a socio-technical system is formed. And it takes the form of a complex system as it grows. So to summarize, basically a socio-technical system is complex, includes a lot of lines of code, graphics, all of that, databases, and the important part is the need for it to interact and be dependent on each other. And the second and more important part is the socio-technical aspect of it, which is the human interaction part. Now if I have to switch gears and look at the software systems that we have today, a lot of the enterprise level software systems fit into this one. Not so how the modern day definition of socio-technical designs are. So you typically may not be able to pass off a Gmail or a web chat or any of those websites and applications as social-technical systems. But on the contrary, you will see in an example later, in the healthcare industry, this is still in practice because of the way the structuring of the organization is maintained. That's where this fits in, because it's closely tied with that aspect of design. I'll give you a quick history, and this, by the image you could recall that these are all during the industrialization age. Okay, and this is when the actual term or the concept came into the picture. So during the industrialization, you have heard of a lot of dehumanized setups which was exploiting labor. And there was a necessity at that point of time to really ensure that there was an environment which is conducive for people to work in. And that's when this term actually came in. So socio-technical design really didn't talk about the interaction between people and the system, also took into consideration the environment, it took into consideration a lot of other factors, which meant that we needed to improve the quality of life of people. And so if you examine socio-technical design in general, it also considers the environment aspects, which were in a very bad shape during the early industrialization. Okay. So as you see, the aim of it was really to bring in better, working conditions. Initial focus was more on factories and offices, and that's where they actually started bringing in. But during the 70s and onwards, if you see, is when the computers started kicking in. Computers actually came into being then, and that became part of the process where you bring in automation and all of that. So people had to manage. They had to ensure that jobs are not lost with the introduction of computers, so on and so forth. But at the same time, it helped in a big way to actually ease things out in the work environment. So 70s was when the computers started kicking in. And the period between 80s and 90s was when social technical design took a different turn, where participatory design came into the picture. So that's when people started talking about end users, satisfaction of the end users, so on and so forth. And the last but not the least, the political dimension of the workplace democracy. Because if you notice, even now you have companies which are so stringent in terms of their hierarchy that things don't move unless somebody from the top gives a sign off, right? Which is contrastically different to probably today's startups, where anybody can take a decision, over the board. But as companies grow is when the complexities come. So this gives you a picture of how socio-technology, socio-technical systems and design has actually evolved over time. Here's a quick snapshot into the stack, and look at how it gets more complicated than what is typically expected out of a software engineering system. So you have the basics of the equipment, which is the hardware, the operating system, with Microsoft introducing the operating system very early on. That was the second layer that came in. Then came the communications and data management layer, the application layer, the business processes, finally the organization. And what also makes an important entry into the stack was the societal aspect of it. So how does society get impacted? What are some of the norms and laws that we need to ensure that workplaces and the interaction within the workplaces happen according to these societal norms? So that's the system stack for you. And now let's look at how the contemporary socio-technical design has evolved. So like most of the systems, technical systems have evolved over time. It's been an area of interest for a lot of designers for a lot of period of time, specifically because the information systems were built initially using this system, and people had a lot of interest in this area. But there were drawbacks in this because, like I said, it was introduced during the industrial age, and they had a very prescriptive approach to design. So people were meant to follow certain steps, and they thought that following that will ultimately lead to a system which is complete, which is usable, and which will probably fit the needs of all the users, but which wasn't the case. And people through their studies and through various other sources realized that it had to be incremental, it had to be iterative, it had to be ongoing, and that was an important aspect that came into the picture. Another important aspect was there were multiple stakeholders if you look at it. So there are not only users, there are people who work within the organization themselves, there are stakeholders, there's society, there's so many end users who are in the picture. So it wasn't actually clear as to when you talk about participatory design, who are your users and what user representatives you can pick up, for these studies. So these are some of the areas where it made it a little convoluted as to what socio-technical systems actually were meant to be. So this is where actually HCI kicks in. So human-computer interaction started kicking in here. So if you look at the roots of human-computer interaction and user interface design, they were actually influenced a lot by socio-technical design. And a lot of gaps that we were talking about earlier were actually being filled in by the HCI experts. So I told you about the fact that the iterative aspect of it wasn't really there in socio-technical design. So that was something that came in with user-centered design. And people started understanding that sometimes users themselves don't know what they want. So you need to come up with the process of iteration where they actually tell you something, you build on it, you retest it, and then you come back with something that actually fits. So that's where all of these concepts started coming in. And the other important aspect where HCI and UCD specialists really made a difference was the fact that they would prefer empirical background studies. So they would actually do studies like user research, usability testing, and come up with statistical reports which clarify as to why something works better than something else. That's exactly the difference. Now, if you see between socio-technical systems and where UCD or user-centered design systems came in. Apart from that, there are a few other differences which I'd like to point out. Socio-technical systems looks at a lot of stakeholders, like I mentioned. They look at society at large, while the other aspect of it, they're looking at individual users, right? So when you're looking at user experience for a particular product or for a particular application, you're looking at an end user's needs, or at the most, a group of end users. If you look at the way you approach it, you typically have personas, but what we typically focus on is the primary persona, right? And that's where the difference is between the socio-technical system and the user-centered design process. Apart from that, the socio-technical design looks at a very holistic approach where they're looking at the complete system of how everything works with each other. While UCD is the other way around, you might look at just a subsystem. So the bigger picture and how things come together, how things work together is what socio-technical design is all about. Moving into some examples of the consequences of socio-technical, not considering socio-technical design systems. Here's an example of the gap that's typically provided. So when you follow a pure technical approach to any software system, you are bound to end up with some gaps. And folder. Google's now realized that there's a concept called grey mail. I don't know how many of you have heard of this, but grey mail is not really spam, but it could be something that we have subscribed to. We have subscribed on our own will. We want to hear from probably a meetup group or probably a biking group or something like that. So we want to actually make sure that email comes to us. But over time, that has also grown, right? So how do you filter them out?
Guys, so
if you look at
the problems. Okay.
Yeah.
So the more we discuss, we will be having more problems. We will be having more a list of the problems. So we just want to focus what comes to your mind.
Your primary mail,
what is the main
your
problem?
core mail, versus your social, versus your promotions. So they have figured out how to manage your grey mail.
Think about the target users,
but may not be. All of this is consuming your bandwidth. This is probably consuming your time in terms of cleaning up your data. It's all of these issues are actually compounding. And if you look at some of the statistics, it's alarming. Okay, in 2002, 2003, it was around 20% the spam, and look at how it's jumped around 90% in 2010. And the statistics actually predict that it's going to 95% by 2050. Whenever we hear about it now. So this is something that's happening in the background, not very oblivious to the user, but something that we need to be aware of because it impacts us indirectly and society at large. So this is an example of the consequence of not considering socio-technical design. So why do we do this, right? So why do we still need socio-technical design? So I must tell you that currently socio-technical design is not very popular across the board, because I told you it's got a prescriptive way of going about it. It's got design principles which are slightly more different. And with the advent of the lean methodology, this has taken a backseat. But it's still applicable because it looks at things very holistically. It looks at things keeping all the stakeholders in mind. And also there are organizational changes with regards to the structure and the business processes that only this method brings in now. None of the other methods of your user experience design process doesn't bring in, your UCD design process doesn't bring in. So this is got its own application. Maybe it's limited at this point of time, but people, particularly in the healthcare organization, would need to know about this because it's got a direct impact there. In healthcare, they have a very streamlined process about going things. In fact, a scientific method in terms of structuring the organization and running the organization. So in such cases, a socio-technical system, design actually works. I'll jump to another case, and this will probably give you a picture of how it really happens in the medical, or the healthcare industry. And I've just thrown in a few users over here to give you a sense of all the communities that need to be taken care of, all the multiple personas that need to be taken care of in this system. So you obviously have the stakeholder, you have the designer, you have the coder, you have an architect, you have a nurse who could be actually using the system or connected to the system. There are doctors, there are physicians, there are multiple levels of them which I have not included. There are vendors who I have not included. I've included one important player over here who's the patient. And look at their mindset about what all they're thinking from and expecting from the system, right? The stakeholders obviously looking at both in terms of increase in service but decrease in cost in terms of the application itself. Designer's got his own challenges about designing a system which is complex as this. The coder has got his own database architectural problems. The architect needs to look at optimizing code and things like that. The nurse is looking at how can we provide patient assistance and support quickly, while the patient has different problems. How can I feel at home? How can I get that support and care? Is something that they're looking at. Okay, and look at how all of this